June 3, 1942, over the vast, shimmering emptiness of the Central Pacific, the air was thick with the humidity of a tropical morning. Inside the cramped cockpit of a PBY Catalina patrol plane, Ensign Jack Reed squinted against the glare of the rising sun. For hours, his crew had seen nothing but the less blue of the ocean, a monotonous landscape that had lulled many pilots into a false sense of security. But at exactly 9:25 a.m., something broke the horizon. Tiny gray specks, no larger than pinpricks, disrupted the seam between the sea and the sky. As Reed banked his aircraft and reached for his binoculars, he realized he wasn't looking at a merchant convoy or a stray fishing fleet. He was looking at the vanguard of the most powerful naval force ever assembled by the Empire of Japan. This moment was the physical manifestation of a ghost the Americans had been hunting in the shadows of the airwaves for months. To understand why Jack Reed was in that specific patch of ocean at that specific time, one has to look back at the windowless basement of the old administration building at Pearl Harbor. There, in a cramped space known as Station Hypo, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of eccentric codebreakers were fighting a different kind of war. They were dressed in smoking jackets and slippers, working around the clock to unravel the Japanese naval code known as JN-25B. For weeks they had been tracking a massive operation centered on a target designated only as AF. Rochefort was convinced that AF was Midway, a tiny atoll that served as the final sentry guarding the Hawaiian Islands. However, the high command in Washington was skeptical, fearing the Japanese might be aiming for the West Coast or the Aleutians. To settle the debate, Rochefort orchestrated one of the most brilliant ruses in military history. He instructed the garrison at Midway to fake unencrypted radio message claiming that their water distillation plant had broken down. Within 48 hours, the trap was sprung. American listeners intercepted a Japanese report stating that AF was low on fresh water. The mystery was solved. The target was Midway. By the time the sun rose on June 3, Admiral Chester Nimitz had already gambled the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet on this intelligence. He knew that the Japanese, led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, were operating under a cloud of overconfidence known as the victory disease. Having tasted nothing but triumph since Pearl Harbor, the Japanese planners assumed the Americans were too demoralized to offer a serious challenge. They believed they would achieve total surprise, drawing the American carriers into a decisive ambush. They had no idea that it was they who were sailing into a snare. As the report from Reed's PBY reached Pearl Harbor at 11 a.m., the tension in the American command centers reached a breaking point. The sighting confirmed the bearing and distance of the Japanese invasion group, positioned about 700 miles west of Midway. While these were not the heavy carriers that Nimitz truly feared, they were proof that the Japanese plan was unfolding exactly as Rochefort had predicted. Nimitz now had the one thing no commander in the Pacific had possessed until that moment: the initiative. He had already dispatched his 3 carriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown, to a rendezvous point northeast of Midway, a patch of empty water they called Point Luck. The Yorktown's presence was a miracle in itself. Just weeks earlier, it had been heavily damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Japanese intelligence reported it sunk, but American shipwrights at Pearl Harbor had worked a Herculean shift, performing months of repairs in just 72 hours. While the Japanese ships maintained strict radio silence, believing themselves to be invisible, the Americans were silently waiting in the dark, their fingers on the trigger. History often remembers the fire and the fury of the dive bombers, the screams of engines, and the sinking of great steel giants. But the 48 hours that lost Japan the Pacific began in the quiet, in the scratch of a pencil over a code sheet and the steady gaze of a pilot over a vast ocean. This was a victory of the mind before it was ever a victory of the gun. The intelligence trap had stripped away the only shield the Japanese had, the element of surprise. In these early hours of June 3, the tide of the war didn't just turn. It was redirected by men who realized that in the modern age, information was more lethal than any shell. It serves as a poignant reminder that the course of nations is often decided not by the size of their fleets, but by the clarity of their vision. The Japanese were sailing toward a horizon they thought they owned, unaware that the world they knew had already vanished beneath the waves of a trap they never saw coming. June 4, 1942, 400 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, the pre-dawn stillness was shattered by the rhythmic roar of Nakajima and Mitsubishi engines. At 4:30 a.m., Admiral Chuichi Nagumo gave the order that had been months in the making. 108 aircraft rose from the decks of the Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. It was a magnificent display of naval power, a swarm of steel aimed directly at the heart of the American outpost. For Nagumo, this was meant to be the knockout blow that would draw out the American fleet and secure the Pacific once and for all. By 6:30 a.m., the Japanese strike force, led by Lieutenant Yoichi Tomonaga, sighted the tiny specks of sand and coral that comprised Midway. The ensuing carnage was spectacular but ultimately indecisive. Despite the heavy smoke rising from fuel tanks and hangars, Tomonaga looked down and saw a resilient enemy. The American defenses were battered but not broken, and the island's airfield remained functional. His radio message back to the fleet at 7 a.m. was brief and chilling. There is a need for a second strike. This message placed Nagumo in the middle of a tactical nightmare. His military doctrine was clear: never leave your carriers vulnerable. He had kept nearly half of his strike force in reserve, armed with lethal Type 91 torpedoes, specifically to counter any American ships that might appear. However, his reconnaissance scouts had reported nothing but empty ocean. To Nagumo's mind, the American carriers were still hundreds of miles away in Hawaii, if they were even at sea at all. The perceived absence of an enemy fleet made the threat from Midway seem much more immediate. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo made the choice that would echo through history. Believing he had the luxury of time, he ordered the reserve aircraft to be taken below deck to have their torpedoes removed and replaced with ground attack bombs. It was a laborious process that turned the flight decks and hangars of his carriers into high-explosive powder kegs. Crews worked feverishly, unbolting heavy torpedoes and rolling them onto racks, often leaving them scattered across the decks instead of returning them to the safety of the magazines to save precious minutes. Then the unthinkable happened. At 7:28 a.m., a scout plane from the cruiser Tone finally reported a sighting. 10 ships, apparently enemy. The bridge of the Akagi fell into a stunned silence. Nagumo's heart must have skipped a beat. If there were ships out there, his decision to rearm was a catastrophic gamble. He was caught between two worlds, with half his planes armed for an island they had not finished off, and the other half in the middle of a frantic, dangerous transition. For the next several minutes, Nagumo waited in an agony of uncertainty. Were there carriers among those ships? It was not until 8:20 a.m. that the scout confirmed the presence of at least one American carrier. By then, Tomonaga's first wave was returning, low on fuel and riddled with holes, circling the fleet and demanding to land. Nagumo faced a horrific choice: launch his currently disorganized strike force now to hit the American fleet with a mix of incorrect weapons, or recover his returning pilots first, rearm everything properly, and launch a coordinated, lethal strike. He chose to wait. He chose the order and precision of Japanese naval tradition over the chaotic necessity of the moment. By 9:17 a.m., the last of Tomonaga's planes had landed. The decks were clear, and the final preparations for a massive counterstrike began. But those few hours spent swapping bombs for torpedoes had cost him more than just time. They had cost him the initiative. This moment of hesitation, born of a rigid adherence to doctrine and a failure to imagine the enemy's proximity, illustrates the fragile nature of command. Nagumo was a man of the old guard, trained in a world where battles were won by the most disciplined line of battle, not the most flexible. His dilemma highlights a universal truth of warfare. The greatest enemy is often not the one across the horizon, but the one within the commander's own mind, the reluctance to abandon a plan when the reality of the battlefield has shifted. The torpedoes lying on the hangar floors were physical manifestations of a strategy that had failed to account for the unpredictable. As the sun climbed higher over the Pacific, the shadow of Nagumo's decision grew long, casting a dark pall over the future of the empire. History would remember these minutes not for the steel that was launched, but for the indecision that kept it tethered to the deck, proving that in the theater of war, the most expensive commodity is a second chance that never comes. June 4, 1942, aboard the flagship Akagi, the atmosphere was a toxic mixture of frantic energy and suffocating dread. Below the flight deck, in the enclosed hangars of the Kido Butai, the world was a labyrinth of steel, sweat, and high explosives. Admiral Nagumo's orders to switch munitions had turned the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy into a floating powder keg. Ground crews worked until their lungs burned, manhandling 800-pound torpedoes and 550-pound land bombs across oil-slicked floors. In the rush to rearm for a second strike against Midway, safety protocols were discarded as a luxury the Empire could no longer afford. Instead of being returned to the protected magazines deep in the bowels of the ships, ordnance was stacked haphazardly against the hangar walls. Fuel hoses snaked across the decks like black serpents, pulsing with high-octane aviation spirit. It was a scene of industrial desperation, a race against a clock that was already winding down. At 9:30 a.m., the Japanese carriers were at their most potent and yet their most fragile. The flight decks were being spotted for a massive counterstrike, a thunderous wave of steel intent to wipe the American presence from the ocean forever. But while the mechanics labored below, the air above was becoming a graveyard. For the last hour, waves of American torpedo bombers, the slow, lumbering TBD devastators, had been arriving in uncoordinated suicidal lunges. They came in low, skimming the whitecaps, drawing every Japanese eye and every anti-aircraft gun toward the horizon. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, the deadly A-6M Zeros, dove from the clouds to intercept them. They swarmed the American squadrons, tearing the devastators apart in a one-sided slaughter that left the ocean littered with burning wreckage and dying men. By 10 a.m., the Japanese commanders felt a sense of grim satisfaction. They had swatted away the American Hornets, and the skies seemed clear. The Zeros, however, were now at sea level, their cannons empty and their fuel low. They were out of position, and the high-altitude ceiling was left completely unguarded. This was the window of vulnerability that history would never allow to close. While the Japanese lookouts peered through their binoculars at the waves, searching for more torpedo wakes, they failed to look into the blinding glare of the midday sun. They were blind to the descent of the very instrument that would their empires reach. At 10:20 a.m., the fate of the Pacific shifted on the glint of a single wake. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise's dive bombers, had been searching an empty ocean until he spotted the Japanese destroyer Arashi, which was racing to rejoin the main fleet. He followed it like a compass needle pointing toward destiny. Minutes later, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers appeared on the horizon, their massive red suns painted on the forward decks gleaming like bullseyes. At 10:22 a.m., the silence of the high altitudes was shattered by the scream of Wright Cyclone engines. The American SPD Dauntless dive bombers fell from the sky like vengeful gods. For the Japanese sailors on the decks of the Kaga and the Akagi, there was no warning, only the sudden, terrifying shadow of wings and the shriek of air rushing past dive flaps. On the Akagi, the first bombs missed, but the second hit near the midship elevator, plunging into the hangar deck where the stacked torpedoes and fueled planes waited. The resulting explosion was not merely a strike. It was a physical realization of Nagumo's indecision. The hangar became a furnace of blossoming fire, the loose ordnance detonating in a chain reaction that tore the ship's heart out from the inside. Within 4 minutes, 3 carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu, were transformed into drifting infernos. The transition from the height of naval supremacy to a state of absolute ruin happened in less time than it takes to boil a pot of tea. The sheer concentration of flammable material, the exposed fuel lines, and the stacks of bombs that should have been in the magazines turned every carrier into a self-destructive engine of war. This window of vulnerability was a tragedy of timing, where the arrival of the dive bombers coincided perfectly with the moment the Japanese were least prepared to def themselves. As the smoke rose in black pillars that could be seen for 50 miles, the era of the battleship died, and the myth of Japanese invincibility died with it. Those 5 minutes taught the world that naval power is not measured merely in tons of steel or the number of cannons, but in the terrifying fragility of a system under pressure. The legacy of the Kido Butai is not found in its grand victories, but in the charred remains resting 4 miles beneath the Pacific surface. It serves as a haunting reminder that in the mechanized chaos of modern conflict, a single lapse in judgment or a few minutes of exposure can erase decades of preparation. The Pacific did not just claim ships that morning, it claimed the momentum of a nation, proving that the margin between glory and catastrophe is often thinner than the skin of an aircraft wing. June 4, 1942, northwest of Midway Atoll, the zenith of Japanese naval power vanished in a span of time shorter than a mid-morning tea break. At 10:20 a.m., the Kido Butai was a picture of terrifying efficiency and seemingly untouchable grace. Admiral Nagumo looked across the flight deck of the Akagi, seeing the elite A6M-0s and D3A Val bombers being readied for a second, decisive strike against the American fleet. The air was thick with the scent of high-octane fuel, and the frantic shouts of deck crews working in a fever pitch. No one looked up. They were too preoccupied with the relentless, though ineffective, low-level attacks by American torpedo bombers that had been slaughtered minutes prior. The Japanese combat air patrol was low on the horizon, chasing the last of the devastators, leaving the heavens above the carriers wide open. High above, at nearly 20,000 feet, the sky was a deep, crystalline blue. It was from this emptiness that Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey and his Enterprise dive bombers spotted the shimmering wake of the Japanese destroyer Arashi. Following it like a breadcrumb trail, they looked down to see the 4 great carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy arrayed in a diamond formation, their bright red sun insignias painted on the bows acting as perfect bullseyes. At 10:22 a.m., the screaming dive began. The Kaga was the first to experience the nightmare. Nearly 30 Dauntlesses plummeted from the clouds, their flaps open, gravity turning them into guided missiles. The Japanese anti-aircraft crews barely had time to traverse their guns before the first 1,000-pound bombs struck. One hit near the aft elevator, but the most devastating blow landed right amidships, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the upper hangar. This space was a tinderbox. Fueled aircraft, armed with both torpedoes and contact bombs, were packed wingtip to wingtip. In seconds, the Kaga was no longer a ship, but a floating volcano. The explosions were so violent, they blew the carrier's bridge apart, killing the captain and senior officers instantly. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Richard Best led a small element of 3 aircraft toward the flagship Akagi. Best was a marksman of the highest order, and he knew that to paralyze the fleet, the flagship must burn. At 10:26 a.m., he released his payload. His bomb pierced the flight deck just behind the amidships elevator and detonated in the upper hangar. It was a single surgical strike that sealed the fate of the pride of the fleet. The explosion severed fire mains and ignited the oxygen-enriched fuel lines that ran like veins through the ship. Admiral Nagumo, stunned and surrounded by acrid black smoke, had to be physically persuaded to abandon his post as the bridge became an oven. On the deck below, the beautiful Aichi dive bombers, the very machines intended to conquer the Pacific, were tossed about like toys in a furnace. To the north, the Yorktown's bombers under Maxwell Leslie fell upon the Soryu. 3 direct hits in 3 minutes turned the ship into a charnel house. The bombs blew the flight deck upward like the lid of a boiling pot, spilling burning gasoline into the lower decks where the engineering crews were trapped. By 10:30 a.m., 3 of the 4 carriers that had devastated Pearl Harbor only 6 months earlier were blazing wrecks, their crews forced into the water as the metal beneath their feet began to soften and melt. This was not a slow decline or a tactical retreat. It was an instantaneous evaporation of military capability. The 5 minutes of fate were not just a lucky break for the United States. They were the culmination of a desperate gamble that finally met the hard reality of modern air power. The Japanese doctrine of the decisive battle had been turned against them by pilots who had spent weeks practicing their dives against moving targets. The technical failure to clear the decks and the tactical failure to maintain high-altitude cover merged into a singular point of catastrophe. As the sun began to set on that long June day, the smoke from the 3 carriers rose miles into the atmosphere, a funerary shroud visible for dozens of leagues. The loss of the ships was catastrophic, but the loss of the men was irreplaceable. The veteran pilots who had terrorized the Indian Ocean and the Dutch East Indies were gone, incinerated in the hangars or drowned in the oil-slicked swells. The Pacific War would continue for 3 more bloody years, but the soul of the Imperial Navy died in those 5 minutes. It remains a testament to the terrifying fragility of power, proving that the greatest empires can be unmade not by decades of attrition, but by a few young men in canvas-winged planes, a patch of clear sky, and a single moment of perfect, devastating timing. The fire that consumed the Akagi did more than melt steel. It burned away the myth of invincibility, leaving behind only the cold, dark reality of a war that Japan could no longer win. June 4, 1942, on the scorched flight deck of the carrier Hiryu, the morning sun revealed a horizon choked with the black smoke of a dying empire. To the south and west, the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were already drifting infernos, their skeletal remains listing into the deep, but the Hiryu, the sole surviving jewel of the Kido Butai, remained untouched. Amidst the chaos, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi did not seek a path for retreat. He was a man of cold, calculated aggression, and he knew that as long as one Japanese flight deck remained operational, the battle was not over. He ordered his remaining air crews to prepare for a strike that would decide the fate of the Pacific. The first counterstrike launched at 10:50 a.m., led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. These 18 VAL dive bombers were the elite remnants of a force that had once terrorized the world's oceans. They followed the thin trail of returning American planes, cutting through the vast blue expanse until they finally sighted Task Force 17. At its center steamed the USS Yorktown, a ship the Japanese High Command believed had been destroyed weeks earlier at the Corals Sea. The sight of her defiant silhouette must have seemed like a ghost rising from the waves by 12 p.m. The sky above the Yorktown had become a terrifying web of anti-aircraft fire and screaming engines. Kobayashi's pilots pressed their attack with a ferocity born of desperation. 3 bombs found their mark. One pierced the flight deck, another detonated deep within the ship's funnel, and a third blew through the hull. The Yorktown shuddered and groaned to a halt, her boilers extinguished and her decks slick with oil. To the Japanese pilots who managed to limp back to the Hiryu, it appeared they had leveled the playing field. They reported the American carrier dead in the water, a flaming wreck destined for the bottom. But the Japanese underestimated the sheer tenacity of American damage control. While the Hiryu prepared a second wave, the Yorktown's repair crews performed the impossible. They patched the holes, redirected power, and by 2 p.m. the carrier was back underway, making 19 knots. When the second wave of Hiryu's torpedo planes, led by Lieutenant Yoichi Tomonaga, arrived at 2:30 p.m., they saw her ship steaming proudly and assumed it was a second, undamaged American carrier. Tomonaga, flying a plane with a leaking fuel tank and no hope of return, led his Kate bombers into a wall of steel. 2 torpedoes ripped into the Yorktown's port side, knocking out all power and causing a massive list. At 2:55 p.m., the order was given to abandon ship. Yamaguchi believed he had finally evened the score, but his triumph was a mirage. He had hit the same ship twice, while the Enterprise and the Hornet remained hidden and lethal. The window of Japanese hope slammed shut at 5 p.m. Scout planes from the Enterprise finally located the Hiryu. Within minutes, 24 dauntless dive bombers were screaming down from the clouds, their pilots fueled by the memory of Pearl Harbor. The Hiryu's gunners fought with suicidal bravery, but the American onslaught was relentless. 4,000-pound bombs struck the forward deck in rapid succession. The explosion was so violent that the forward elevator was blown upward, coming to rest against the bridge like a jagged tombstone. The Hiryu was now a drifting furnace, her internal structures melting under the intense heat. Throughout the long, agonizing night, the crew fought to save the ship, but the fires were uncontrollable. At 5 a.m. the following morning, Admiral Yamaguchi gathered his remaining officers. He apologized for the failure and ordered his men to leave. He and Captain Tomeo Kaku chose to remain behind, tying themselves to the bridge to share the final moments of their vessel. As the sun rose on June 5, a Japanese destroyer fired torpedoes to scuttle the Hiryu, seeing the last of the Kido Butai's flight decks to the cold darkness of the sea floor. The loss of the Hiryu was the final period of a long, bloody sentence. In just 24 hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy had transitioned from the undisputed master of the seas to a defensive force clinging to a vanishing dream. The Kido Butai, once an invincible sword that had struck from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean, was shattered beyond repair. It wasn't just the loss of steel and oil. It was the loss of thousands of veteran pilots and mechanics whose decades of experience could never be replaced by the raw recruits of the years to come. Midway was not merely a tactical defeat. It was a psychological amputation. The ocean that Japan had hoped to turn into a private lake had instead become a vast graveyard for her grandest ambitions. The victory belonged to the industrial might of America, but more so to the audacity of young men who flew into the teeth of death when the odds were stacked against them. As the Hiryu slipped beneath the waves, she took with her the strategic initiative of the entire war. The Pacific was no longer a Japanese theater. The tide had not just turned. It had retreated with such violence that it left the Imperial High Command standing on a barren shore, staring at a horizon they would never again control. The war would continue for 3 more years, but the outcome was written in the oil slicks and floating debris of Midway. History is often a slow crawl of change, but on this day it was a sudden, roaring avalanche that buried an empire in the span of a single afternoon. June 5, 1942, on the bridge of the super battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto finally surrendered to the weight of a catastrophe he could no longer ignore. He had spent the last 48 hours chasing a phantom victory, but as the sun rose over the vast, empty Pacific, the reality of his situation was as clear as the blue water beneath him. His carriers were gone, his elite pilots were dead or swimming in burning oil, and the strategic initiative had evaporated like mist. At 3 a.m. that morning, Yamamoto had issued the order that haunted him until his death: the cancellation of the Midway operation and a general retreat. It was the first time in centuries that the Japanese Navy had been forced to turn its back on an enemy and flee. This was the price of hubris, a concept the Japanese referred to as victory disease. For 6 months, the Imperial Navy had moved across the ocean with a sense of divine entitlement, believing that their spirit and tactical brilliance could overcome the sheer physical mass of the United States. But at Midway, that spirit ran headlong into the cold, calculated reality of modern warfare. The Japanese command had built a plan of such staggering complexity that it left no room for the friction of war. They assumed the Americans would react exactly as scripted, failing to account for the grit of the American sailor, or the genius of the codebreakers at Station Hypo. By the time Admiral Nagumo realized he was in a fight for his life at 10:26 a.m. on June 4, the trap had already been sprung. The failure at Midway was not merely a tactical blunder. It was a fundamental collapse of command philosophy. While the Americans operated under a flexible command structure that empowered individual initiative, the Japanese remained shackled to rigid hierarchies and outdated notions of the decisive battle. They sought a single, glorious afternoon of destruction, while the Americans were preparing for a war of attrition and industrial urance. This shift in the nature of conflict signaled the era of the samurai and the dawn of the era of the factory. As the burning remains of the Kaga and Akagi sank into the abyss, they took with them the dream of a Japanese hegemony in the East. The global implications of these 48 hours cannot be overstated. Before Midway, the Axis powers seemed unstoppable, carving up the map of the world with a terrifying efficiency. After Midway, the path to Tokyo was paved with the certainty of Allied victory. The Pacific became an American lake, not because of a single stroke of luck, but because the United States possessed the capacity to learn from its wounds, while Japan remained blinded by its triumphs. The loss of nearly 300 aircraft and over 3,000 men, including the cream of the naval air arm, created a vacuum that Japan could never fill. For the rest of the war, they would be fighting a defensive struggle, trading blood for time, while the American war machine surged forward with a momentum that defied logic. When we look back at the wreckage of the Midway operation, we see more than just sunken ships. We see the moment the world's center of gravity shifted. The European empires were already crumbling, and the Japanese attempt to build a new one in their image died in the fires of the Central Pacific. What emerged from the smoke was a new global order, one defined by carrier decks and long-range logistics, where power was measured in tons of steel and gallons of aviation fuel. History often moves in long, slow cycles, but at Midway, it pivoted in a single heartbeat. The ocean is vast and indifferent, hiding the scars of those 48 hours beneath miles of dark water. Yet the echoes of the battle still resonate in the way nations project power today. The lesson remains as stark now as it was then. No amount of bravery can compensate for a failure of vision, and no empire is so grand that it cannot be humbled by its own arrogance. The men who fought there, on both sides, were caught in the gears of a transformation they could barely perceive, yet their actions determined the fate of generations. As the currents pull at the rusted hulls of the great carriers, we are left to reflect on the fragility of power and the terrifying speed with which an entire world can be lost. The Pacific remains a graveyard of ambitions, a silent witness to the day when the sun began its long, inevitable descent toward the horizon.